Working the night shift changes you. There's something about being awake when the rest of the world sleeps that makes you see things differently. The silence becomes heavier, the shadows stretch longer, and sometimes you encounter things that no amount of daylight can ever erase from your memory. Tonight, I'm sharing 3 true stories from people who work the night shift, stories that still haunt them to this day. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real experiences from real people who are just trying to earn a living in the dead of night. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't work the night shift alone. This first story comes from a guy named Derek who worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour gas station just outside of a small town in Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place where you'd see maybe 5 customers between midnight and 6 a.m. on a good night. Derek had been working there for about 3 months when this happened. He told me the job was easy enough. Stock shelves, clean the coffee station, ring up the occasional trucker passing through. Most nights, he'd just sit behind the counter watching videos on his phone, waiting for his shift to end. But one night in late October, everything changed. It was around 2:30 in the morning. Derek was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when he heard the bell above the door chime. He looked up to see a woman walk in. She was probably in her mid-30s, wearing a long gray coat that looked too heavy for the weather. Her hair was dark and wet, plastered to her face like she'd been caught in the rain. The strange thing was, it hadn't been raining. Derek said hello, but the woman didn't respond. She just stood there by the entrance, staring at him with these wide, unblinking eyes. He remembers feeling uncomfortable immediately, like something was off about her, but he tried to brush it aside. Working night shift, you get used to weird people coming in at odd hours. The woman finally started moving, walking slowly down the aisles. Derek watched her on the security monitor. She wasn't looking at the products, she was just walking, pacing back and forth, her head tilted at an odd angle, like she was listening for something. After about 5 minutes of this, Derek decided to check on her. "Ma'am, can I help you find something?" he called out from behind the counter. She stopped moving. Then, very slowly, she turned to face him. And when she smiled, Derek felt his blood run cold. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, stretching across her face in a way that didn't look human. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Derek asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the phone under the counter. "The voices," she said, her smile never faltering. "They're so loud tonight." Derek didn't know what to say. He just stood there, frozen, as this woman stared at him with that horrible smile. Then she started walking toward the counter, slowly, deliberately, her wet shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor with each step. "I'm going to need you to leave," Derek said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Right now." But she kept coming. And as she got closer, Derek noticed something that made his stomach turn. The water dripping from her hair and clothes. It wasn't clear. It was dark, almost black, and it smelled like rot. When she reached the counter, she leaned forward, so close that Derek could see his reflection in her glassy eyes. "They told me to come here," she whispered. "They said you'd understand." That's when Derek grabbed the phone and dialed 911. But the moment he started talking to the dispatcher, the woman's expression changed. The smile vanished. Her face went blank, emotionless. And then she just turned around and walked out. Derek watched through the window as she crossed the parking lot and disappeared into the darkness beyond the gas pumps. He gave the police her description when they arrived 20 minutes later, but they never found her. Here's the part that still keeps Derek up at night, though. 2 days after that incident, he was taking out the trash behind the station when he noticed something weird. There were wet footprints on the pavement leading from the woods behind the building to the back door. The same dark, oily water he'd seen dripping from that woman. He followed the footprints. They led to the dumpster area, then stopped at a drainage grate. Derek peered down into the grate with his flashlight, and what he saw made him quit that job the same day. There were scratch marks, deep gouges in the metal, like someone had been trying to claw their way up from inside the drain. And at the bottom, floating in the stagnant water, was a gray coat. The same coat that woman had been wearing. Derek never found out who she was or what she wanted. But sometimes, late at night, he still wonders if she's still down there, waiting, listening to the voices that only she can hear. The second story comes from a woman named Lisa, who worked as a night shift custodian at a large hospital in Ohio. She'd been working there for almost a year when this happened, and she knew the building inside and out, every hallway, every storage closet, every dark corner. But there was one place she always avoided when she could: the basement. The hospital basement was where they kept old medical equipment, discontinued supplies, and patient records that hadn't been digitized yet. It was a maze of concrete corridors and flickering fluorescent lights that always seemed on the verge of going out completely. Most of the custodial staff hated going down there, and they'd often trade assignments just to avoid it. Lisa usually managed to avoid basement duty too, but one night in December, she drew the short straw. Her supervisor handed her a checklist of areas that needed cleaning, and right at the bottom of the list was basement storage, corridor C. She remembers standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into that yellowish light, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Something felt wrong that night. She couldn't explain it, but she almost turned around and told her supervisor she was sick. But she needed this job. So she took a deep breath, grabbed her cleaning cart, and headed down. The basement was always cold, but that night it felt arctic. Lisa's breath came out in visible puffs as she pushed her cart down corridor C. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in sickly shadows. She worked quickly, mopping the floor and emptying trash cans, counting the minutes until she could leave. That's when she heard it. Singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the lights, a child's voice singing a lullaby. Lisa stopped mopping and listened. The voice was coming from somewhere deeper in the basement, past the storage rooms. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice echoed off the concrete walls. The singing stopped. Lisa waited, her heart pounding. She knew there shouldn't be any children in the hospital basement at 3 a.m. She knew she should probably call security, but something made her move forward following the sound. She found herself in a section of the basement she'd never been to before. The lights here were dimmer, and many of them were completely out. Old hospital beds lined the walls, their metal frames rusted and skeletal. Medical equipment from decades ago sat collecting dust. And at the very end of the corridor, she saw a door. It was slightly ajar, and a pale light was filtering out from inside. The singing started again. Lisa approached the door slowly, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. She pushed it open, and what she saw inside made her breath catch in her throat. It was an old operating room, the kind they hadn't used since probably the 1970s. The surgical table was still in the center of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust. And sitting on that table, barely visible in the dim light, was a music box. It was playing by itself. The lullaby filled the room, tinny and distorted. Lisa watched as the tiny ballerina inside the music box spun around and around, but there was no one else there. No child. No explanation for how the music box had started playing on its own. She should have left then. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. But Lisa made the mistake of walking closer, drawn by a morbid curiosity. As she approached the music box, she noticed something underneath it. A piece of paper, yellowed with age. She picked it up with trembling fingers and read the handwritten note. "To Emma, may you dance forever. Love, Daddy." The moment she read those words, the music box stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, in that silence, Lisa heard breathing. Not her own breathing, someone else's, coming from right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty operating room and the dark corridor beyond. But she could still hear it. Slow, labored breathing, like someone struggling for air. Lisa ran. She abandoned her cleaning cart and sprinted back through the basement corridors, the breathing following her the entire way. It echoed off the walls, growing louder and more desperate with each step. She didn't stop until she burst through the stairwell door and into the bright lights of the main hospital. The next day, Lisa asked her supervisor about that operating room. Her supervisor looked confused. According to the hospital records, there was no operating room in that section of the basement. That entire wing had been condemned 15 years ago after a fire. It was supposed to be sealed off. But Lisa had been there. She'd seen it. And when maintenance finally agreed to check it out, they found the door she'd gone through. It had been welded shut from the inside. No one could explain how Lisa had gotten in, or what she'd really seen down there in the dark. She requested a transfer to the day shift the following week. But she still drives past that hospital sometimes, late at night. And every time she does, she can't help but look at the basement windows, wondering if somewhere down in that darkness, a music box is still playing. The final story comes from a man named Marcus, who worked as a night security guard at a large distribution warehouse in Texas. It was one of those massive facilities, probably 200,000 square feet of concrete floors, metal shelving that reached up to the ceiling, and long, empty aisles that seemed to go on forever. Marcus had been working there for about 6 months when this incident occurred. His job was simple: patrol the warehouse every hour, check that all the doors were locked, and monitor the security cameras from his office near the front entrance. Easy money, he thought. Nothing ever happened. Until the night he met the man in the blue coveralls. It was a Tuesday night in March. Around 1 a.m. Marcus was doing his hourly patrol, walking through the warehouse with his flashlight, checking aisles, and making sure everything was secure. The warehouse was temperature controlled, but for some reason, it felt unusually cold that night. He was walking down aisle 47 when he saw someone standing at the far end, a man in blue coveralls, facing away from him, just standing there, not moving. Marcus's first thought was that it was another employee who'd stayed late, but that didn't make sense. Everyone clocked out by 6 p.m., and Marcus had checked the sign-in sheet. He was supposed to be alone. "Hey!" Marcus called out. "Sir, the warehouse is closed. You need to leave." The man didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Marcus walked closer, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. "I'm serious, you need to..." The man turned around. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. Something was wrong with the man's face. It was blurry. Like looking at someone through frosted glass. Marcus couldn't make out any features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth, flesh-colored blur where a face should be. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered. The man raised one hand and pointed down the aisle toward the back of the warehouse. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around a corner. Marcus stood there for a moment, his heart racing, trying to process what he'd just seen. Every logical part of his brain told him to call the police. But curiosity, and maybe a dose of stupidity, made him follow. He found the man again in the loading dock area, standing next to one of the bay doors. Marcus approached slowly, his flashlight beam shaking in his unsteady hand. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What are you doing here?" The man pointed again. This time he was pointing at the bay door, specifically at a padlock that should have been securing it. The padlock was broken, snapped clean in half. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had broken into the warehouse, and this man, whoever or whatever he was trying to show him. "Did you do this?" Marcus asked, but he already knew the answer. The man in the blue coveralls shook his head slowly, then pointed toward the open bay door, pointing outside. Marcus approached the door cautiously and looked out into the parking lot. At first, he didn't see anything unusual, just empty spaces, the distant glow of streetlights, and his own car parked near the entrance. Then he saw the van. It was parked in the shadows at the far edge of the lot, barely visible. A white cargo van with no windows, its engine running, and standing next to it were 3 figures, all wearing ski masks. They were looking directly at him. Marcus's blood turned to ice. He immediately stepped back from the door, fumbling for his radio. "We have a break-in," he shouted into it. "I need police at the warehouse now." He turned to look for the man in the blue coveralls, to ask him what was going on, but the man was gone. Vanished, like he'd never been there at all. The next few minutes were chaos. Marcus ran back to his office and locked himself inside, watching the security camera feeds as the 3 masked figures entered the warehouse through the broken bay door. They were professionals, moving quickly, methodically, heading straight for the high-value electronics stored in the back. The police arrived within 7 minutes. The intruders fled when they heard the sirens, abandoning most of what they'd tried to steal. Marcus gave his statement to the officers, describing everything that had happened, but he left out one detail. He didn't mention the man in the blue coveralls. He knew how that would sound. It wasn't until a week later that Marcus learned the truth. He was talking to the warehouse manager about the break-in when the manager mentioned something strange. "You know, you're not the first guard to report seeing someone in blue coveralls," the manager said. "We had another guard about 3 years ago who claimed he saw the same thing." Marcus felt his stomach drop. What happened to that guard? The manager's expression darkened. He quit after one night, refused to say why. But here's the weird part. Before this place was a distribution warehouse, it was a manufacturing plant. And there was an accident here about 20 years ago. One of the workers got crushed by a forklift in the loading dock area. Died instantly. What was he wearing? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Blue coveralls, the manager said. Company uniform. Marcus quit the next day. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't been trying to help him. He'd been trying to warn him. Because sometimes the dead remember the places where they died, and they try to protect them, even after all these years. Marcus never went back to that warehouse, but he heard from a former co-worker that they eventually sealed off the loading dock area where the accident happened. Too many guards kept reporting the same thing. A man in blue coveralls, standing in the shadows, pointing at something no one else could see. Some places remember their tragedies, and some of the dead never really leave. Those were 3 true night shift horror stories that still haunt the people who lived through them. Stories that remind us that the world is different at night, darker, and sometimes we encounter things that can't be explained by logic or reason. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. And remember, if you work the night shift, stay alert, because you never know what might be watching you from the shadows. Until next time, sleep tight.